Okay, so what I'd like to do today is four things. The first thing is I'd like to do a quick comparison of some of the differences between holistic thinking and analytical thinking. And basically, I think the most interesting, some of you probably know some of these differences that I'm going to highlight. They go all the way back in philosophy to the difference between the Greeks and the Chinese. So I'm just going to do some quick comparisons between them. The second thing I want to do is talk about the reasons why these differences between holistic and analytical thinking have occurred. And my talk is based on a book by the name of The Geography of Thought. It's written by a guy named Richard Nisbett, N-E-S-B-E-T-T. And he has a very interesting materialist explanation of why the Chinese thought more holistically and why the Greeks thought more analytically. So the second part of this will be talking about the reasons the differences even exist. Then what I'll do is I'll talk about some qualifications and reservations that I have about the book. And then the fourth part is I would like to pose a couple of questions to you for further thought that we could, maybe continue in the discussion. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start out with giving you just sort of a category, and then I'm going to sort of say holistic says this, analytic says this, and then and we'll just proceed from there. So the first way I'd like to present the differences is holistic thinking, using a metaphor. Holistic thinking is like using a wide lens in a camera where you see the forests more than you see the trees. In analytical thinking, it's as if it's a narrow lens. There's a kind of tunnel vision, and you see the trees, but you don't see the forest. Okay. The second thing is the relationship between form and content. In holistic thinking, form and content go together. In analytical thinking, objects are extracted from their environment and they're treated separately. And a lot of this is where empiricism comes from in philosophy. The third difference is in how things are classified. Like, for example, if I give you three words, carrot, dog, and rabbit, the analytical thinking will simply divide it up into dogs and rabbits are animals, carrots are vegetables. Whereas in the holistic thinking, rabbits and carrots would be brought together because rabbits eat carrots. So in the holistic thinking, the categorization is based on what works situationally in real life, not what type of things are the objects. So I hope that makes sense. The fifth difference is in the relationship between wholes and parts. As I think probably most of you know, holistic thinking says wholes are more than the sum of its parts. In other words, when parts come together, they create something new that's more than either one of those things taken separately. In analytical thinking, wholes are seen as aggregates. That means no more than the sum of their parts. Okay, the next difference is how is nature understood? In holistic thinking, nature is seen as a plenum. In other words, it's filled. Whereas nature for analytical thinking is atoms and the void. right? So like this is Democritus and Epicurean philosophy. That's where that comes from. The next difference has to do with what is nature composed of? And this is one of the most interesting things to me, because in analytical thinking, you've got no things, and then you've got things. Whereas in holistic thinking, you have these interpenetrating substances. So that, you know, in China, you have the 5 elements: wood, fire, air, metal, and water. And so all of nature is simply composed of these 5 processes interacting together, so that there's really no things. There's simply slow moving and rapidly moving processes. Whereas in analytical thinking, there are things. We think of things as solid, eternal, always the same, right? So that's a major difference. And one thing I just want to say something about that's interesting for us to talk about maybe later on is in China and in Japan, this sense of that basically the world is kind of a verb. It's moving, it's slow moving, etc. In their language, they learn verbs before they learn nouns. And in the West, childhood socialization shows that nouns are learned prior to verbs. And so it's really interestingly connected up to the basic philosophical differences of the two. If you look at nature generally, analytical thinking looks at nature as a mechanism, as if it were a machine. In holistic thinking, nature is understood as an organism, and that's connected up to the whole as being more than the sum of its parts. You can also see this in terms of the differences in the social philosophy between the two when you look at some of the social categories. Like in holistic thinking, the organism has interdependent parts. And you can see that expressed in, say, for example, the Japanese ways of working, where you have a worker is seen as an interdependent whole, and they're seen as valuable. And of course, you know, prior to 40 or 50 years ago, the Japanese saw workers as having one job. They're trained very well, and they are an inseparable part of the business organization. Whereas in the West, the way we see machines becomes projected onto the way we do our work. So that, as you probably know, individuals are seen as interchangeable with each other. So there isn't a sense of a lifetime commitment to an organization. We're like parts of a machine that wear out, then they get replaced. So there's an interesting connection here between the general philosophy of holism and analytical, and even those form of social differences in the social organization. Another difference has to do with how opposites are understood. In holistic ways of thinking, opposites are polar. That means they depend on each other, they co-create each other. And a way to think about these opposites is both and. So opposites are seen as relatively different, but then they come back together and they create more wholes. Whereas in the analytic thinking, opposites are understood as dualistic. They go in internally opposite directions, and opposites in analytical thinking seem to have nothing to do with each other. So they're kind of like going this way instead of the polar opposites are different, but then within within the whole, they come together and they produce new things. Another interesting difference is in how contradictions are held. Usually, in the West, of course, thanks to Aristotle, there's his laws of contradiction, which say that contradictions are mutually exclusive. The Chinese, with the exception of one philosopher, didn't see contradictions that way. So again, in the West, we seem to have thought about this whole part relationship, or the analytic and the holistic thinking, as somewhat recent. In other words, a lot of new age stuff that came about in the 70s kind of grabbed onto this, and things are seen as holistic, and they kind of act like this has been an invention of the last 50 years, when really this goes all the way back to the Chinese. Some other really interesting differences that I found is in the world of art. Some of you are probably familiar with this. In holistic thinking, the human face on pictures is generally relatively small. In the West, Western art faces are usually 3 times larger than they are in China. And I think you can imagine why that would be, because the West has a highly individualistic orientation, and so the individual face is going to be seen as more important than the natural environment, whereas in the Chinese, the human face and the human figure is relatively small. Okay. Some of the social differences between the social implications of some of these philosophical differences are, some of you maybe have studied cross-cultural psychology. You know that holistic thinking of the Chinese goes with what's called a collectivist self, which means that the group comes before the individual. And of course, in the West, we have an individualist self, which says the individual is prior to the group. And what matters is what the individual wants, not what the group wants. Another social difference has to do with situations and when something happens to you, to what extent do you blame the situation, or do you blame the disposition within the individual? In holistic thinking, the individual primarily explains problems that have happened to them. First, by the situation, secondly, from their disposition. So to give you an example, if you're on a road and somebody cuts you off, and you have something to do in your mind with when the person cuts you off, you have to figure out how you're going to make sense of that. Well, in holistic thinking, or what the Chinese would generally do, is to say that person must have been late for work. The person maybe was absent-minded and they didn't realize they had to get off the road. Maybe they had to take their kids to the hospital. In other words, there's no ill intent. It's more the situation that the person was in that produced that, erratic behavior. Most people that I know that are, of course, individualists, when somebody does that, they immediately take it as something personal. Like, this person did this because either they're that kind of a person or I'm this kind of a person. And that way of thinking in social psychology is called the Fundamental Attribution Era, because Most of the time, what research shows is situations produce problems between people, not evil intentions of people. But for the individualists tend to blame most things on some personal failing, or if things have gone well, it's because of something they've done personally successfully, not the situation. Couple of more differences. There's something called locus of control, maybe some of you have heard of. In holistic thinking, the Chinese say there's an external locus of control, meaning whatever happens to me is more like fate, luck, the will of the spirits, whereas the individualist or the analytical thinker thinks that has what's called an internal locus of control. And that just simply means you are responsible for what happens to you one way or another. Lastly, there's a lot more comparisons, but I don't want to go too far with these because I want to have some time for us to talk. The last comparison is the attention span. There's two, in psychology, there's two ways of dealing with attention. One is called field dependent and the other is called field independent. The field dependent looks at situations and has a diffused attention span. In other words, they're looking around to try to see everything at once. A field independent orientation looks at mostly what is right in front of them, and they don't really look around. So, for example, if you're in the house and you're building something and you have a field independent orientation, you hear a noise outside, you stop what you're doing, you go to the window, you see what's going on. Because your attention is relatively on the surface, and if something outside that immediate attention comes into your line of vision or hearing, you react to it. The field dependent or the field independent says, no, we're focusing right here. And I think you can understand the holistic would be the field dependent, and the individualistic would be the field dependent. Okay, so what I'd like to get to now is, in some ways, what I think is the most interesting. And that is, why do these differences even exist? Richard Nisbett makes a very interesting ecological, economic, and political explanation for why holism developed more in China and analytical in Greece. The first thing he points to is the ecology of China. He says they have fertile river valleys and low mountains. In Greece, they have arid land, it's very dry, and they have mountains descending to the sea. Okay, so that by itself doesn't mean much, but you'll see as I develop some of these other things that it matters quite a bit. The second thing he points to is rainfall, the adequacy or inadequacy of rainfall. In China, there is generally around the area of the Yellow River, there's not adequate rainfall. So the Chinese have this, and most agricultural civilizations have this dilemma. The dilemma is we're not getting enough rain, but we have this large body of water, and how do we get the water from the large rivers into our farms? And so what they do is they develop a centralized irrigation system. Greece had adequate rainfall, and so there was no irrigation system necessary. So what does that mean? Okay, the first thing is the kind of agriculture that the Chinese practiced was primarily what's called subsistence agriculture. So they planted rice and many of the other grains. Greece, because the land was not good enough to have large-scale subsistence agriculture, they developed what's called commercial agriculture. So they sold olive oil, they had olive groves, but they had to trade to get their foodstuffs. Now, to connect up the large body of water, the inadequacy of rainfall, and the need for irrigation systems. When you have irrigation systems that need to get to large farms and you centralize them, that justifies the development of a large state, right? And the Chinese, they had large states. They broke down, the empires broke down, and then they would rise up again. But basically, they needed to have some sort of centralized political body to organize the irrigation systems. The Greeks didn't have to do that. So the Greeks didn't need any centralized political power throughout all of Greece. And here's where the key relationship is. China developed a centralized political system. The Greeks didn't. And if you think about what do people, I was saying the Greeks are these traders. They're herders, they move around, they trade with other countries. If you think about what you're doing when you're trading, a lot of what you're doing is you're bargaining. You're haggling, you're bargaining, you're negotiating, right? In China, the merchants that they had did not really get out of control, did not have the kind of independence that the merchants had in Greece. And so they didn't get the kind of ongoing regular practice of negotiating and arguing. Now, I think you can see that if you know anything about Greek civilization, they had what's called the polis, right? They had this place where you went and you argued your case. I think there's a relationship between the trading and the negotiating that the merchants had to do when they were working. It kind of developed an argumentation orientation among the Greeks generally, so that even people that were peasants or people that you wouldn't think of would usually think about arguing, they would go to the polis and they would either argue their own case or they would hire somebody to argue for them. The Chinese did not have the same kind of experience. So if you look at the, if you take a class in rhetoric or something and you look at the origins of rhetoric, they always talk about Greece and the Sophists and Aristotle. They're the ones that developed the rhetoric and the argument and the three parts of the rhetorical triangle and things like that. The Chinese did not have that. And so there's a spirit about the Greeks going back and forth, that for the Chinese, because they had a centralized political system, they didn't have the kind of practice in argumentation. Argumentation and debate there was not nearly as developed. In fact, it would be seen as disrespectful to argue the way you would see the Greeks arguing. It would be a sign of a disrespect of authority. Another difference between the Greeks and the Chinese was in terms of diversity. Because of where the Greeks were situated, they had many people coming and going from the areas and trading. So they got used to dealing cross-culturally with a lot of different kind of people. The Chinese, Of course, there were differences, but the differences were between cultures. They didn't have as many cultures that were interacting with each other. And so that produced a greater feeling of people being foreign, people being different, and being inferior. Okay, a couple more points. A couple of more points I want to make. One of the most interesting things Nisbett says to me is, he says that what research shows is that the age of the person, a scientist, when they make new discoveries, is usually when they're very young. In the individualist cultures, youth is much more important, and elders are seen as over the hill. In China, of course, there is great respect for the elders, and the young are expected to keep their place. Well, Nisbett says that there's something about the differences in the respect for age that affects scientific discovery. He says in China, of course, young Chinese men or women are just as capable as anybody in the West of making discoveries. But he says those discoveries, the potential for those discoveries was hampered because there was this expectation of respect for the elder scientists and not showing those scientists up. So the younger scientists that might have some ideas are more likely to keep their mouths shut out of respect for the elders. Whereas in the West, the older scientists are more seen as over the hill, and so there's more room for younger scientists to make their discoveries and to be upfront about it, because youth, it's a sign of respect, it's a sign of scientific curiosity at that age to do these type of things at that age, and there's nothing wrong with it. And then the last point I want to make is the place of debate. In the West, debate and peer review is seen as, part of the course, the normal part of science. What he says about China is that there is less room for debate and peer review because there's a sense of respecting others. And his argument is that sometimes the respect of other people gets in the way of discovering new things. Okay, so the third thing I want to do is I just want to say a couple of my own reservations with this. One of the things I find is that Nisbett talks about the Greeks as if the atomists, and the Epicureans a little bit later on, they were all of what the West had to offer. But that ignores that the West had holistic thinking, or the Greeks had holistic thinking at the same time that they had the analytical thinking. Like, of course, Plato and Aristotle are holistic thinkers compared to Democritus, who's more, and Epicurus, which are more analytical. So the West has a holistic tradition even in Greece, right? And the Chinese also have a smaller analytical and atomistic thinking, but they're of course in the minority. So my first, qualification with this is that it's not like one is all holistic and one is all analytic. It's a question of more or less. The holistic have a minor tradition in atomistic, and the West has also I think a major tradition in thinking holistically, except that it has been suppressed maybe a little bit in the last couple of 100 years. My second reservation is that Nisbett doesn't account for the change in history. In other words, China, ancient China is not China today. And, China evolved, from a couple of hundred BCE all the way up through the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. And there's other traditions that have developed. At the same time, in the West has its own evolutionary trajectory over the course of history and is not simply, there's differences between atomistic thinking in the 17th century and atomistic thinking in the Greeks. So it's not so much these are eternal ways of thinking. They have each section of the world has their own history. Okay, so a couple of questions for you. Based on my talk today, are there any other ecological conditions that we might use to explain other ways of thinking? A couple of examples that I have for that is, for example, England has a tradition of empiricism, and England is an island. Does the fact that it's an island have anything to do with its general philosophy? Same thing with India. It'd be interesting to say, I'd say India is holistic, but can we say that the holism in India is due to the same kinds of geographical and economic conditions that I described as the difference between Greece and China? So, and my other question is, can you think of other countries where Nisbett's thesis would not really apply? So there you go, folks. Have at it. I'd be eager to hear what you have to say.